A little girl stole from a wealthy man on the street, but when he found out what she planned to do with the money, he broke down in tears. The creak of the old bed echoed in the tiny room as Sophie sat up, her tired eyes fixed on the faded clock on the wall. 5:30 a.m. She hadn't slept at all, staying awake all night to the sound of her grandmother's labored breathing. Moving silently, Sophie approached the makeshift bed where Grandma Mary lay. The dim morning light filtered through the patched curtains, revealing the elderly woman's pale and worn face. Sophie gently touched her grandmother's forehead, feeling the fever that wouldn't subside. "Gran," Sophie whispered, her voice shaking, "it's time for your medicine." Grandma Mary opened her eyes slowly, a weak smile forming on her cracked lips. "My angel," she murmured, "don't worry about me. Go back to sleep." Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the world on her 12-year-old shoulders. How could she sleep? How could she even think of resting when... Her eyes drifted to the small table by the bed, where an empty pill bottle lay like a sentence. The last pill had been taken the night before. Without it, the doctors had warned, Grandma Mary's fragile heart wouldn't hold up for long. Sophie stepped away from the bed, moving toward the apartment's single window. Outside, the streets were just beginning to come to life with the first commuters of the morning. People in suits, others in worn uniforms, all part of a world that felt miles away from Sophie's cramped reality. And then she saw him again. The man in the pristine suit with the gleaming watch. Every day at the same time he walked by, talking on his sleek new phone, oblivious to the world around him. Sophie had been watching him for weeks, noticing every detail. How he always stopped at the same corner to check his messages, how his wallet was always in the back pocket of his pressed pants. A terrible idea began to form in Sophie's mind, twisting her stomach and making her heart race. Stealing was wrong, she knew that. Her grandmother had always taught her to be honest, no matter how tough things got. But how tough did things need to get? The sound of a violent cough from Grandma Mary's bed made Sophie turn abruptly. She saw her grandmother writhing in pain, struggling to breathe. In an instant, she was by her side, holding her hand, feeling the chill and tremble of her skin. "Hold on, Gran," Sophie pleaded, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm going to get your medicine, I promise." When the coughing fit passed, and Grandma Mary drifted back to sleep, Sophie found herself at the window once again. The wealthy man would pass by in exactly 1 hour. 1 hour to make a decision that could change her life forever. Sophie looked around the apartment. The worn furniture, the peeling paint, the smell of mildew that no amount of scrubbing could eliminate. Her eyes settled on the only photo of her parents, smiling in a time that seemed like another life. What would they say if they could see her now? What would they say about what she was about to do? With trembling hands, Sophie picked up the photo, tracing her mother's face with her fingers. "Forgive me," she whispered, "but I can't lose Grandma too." Placing the photo back, Sophie began to prepare. She put on her only shirt without holes, tied the worn laces of her sneakers, and pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail. Every movement was deliberate, every action heavy with the weight of her decision. Before leaving, Sophie took one last look at her sleeping grandmother. "I'll be back soon," she promised, her voice barely audible. As she closed the door behind her, Sophie felt as if she were leaving behind more than just her apartment. She was leaving behind her innocence, her security, everything she knew. Descending the stairs of the rundown building, each step brought her closer to a point of no return. The morning sun, now fully risen, seemed to mock her grim mission. On the street, Sophie merged with the growing crowd, her heart pounding so loudly that she feared everyone could hear it. Her eyes scanned the street constantly, searching for the man in the expensive suit. And then there he was, turning the corner, walking in her direction, oblivious to the fate that would unite them in a matter of moments. Sophie closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath and took the first step toward him. A step that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her, in ways she could never imagine. Sophie's heart pounded so hard she feared it would burst from her chest at any moment. Her eyes were fixed on the suited man approaching, unaware of the storm of emotions raging within the young girl. Edward Green walked with the confidence of someone who had never known true need. His impeccable Italian suit and shining shoes contrasted sharply with the worn clothes of the people around him. In one hand, he held a cup of gourmet coffee, in the other, his latest generation smartphone. Sophie watched him stop at his usual corner, taking a moment to check his messages. It was now or never. With her heart in her throat, she approached. Her hands trembled and she felt cold sweat trickling down her back. "Please forgive me, Grandma," she thought, taking the final step toward him. In one quick, clumsy motion, Sophie reached for Edward's back pocket. Her fingers barely touched the edge of his wallet when a strong hand grabbed her wrist. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Edward's deep voice thundered, making Sophie freeze with fear. Time seemed to stop. People around them began to notice the commotion, some pausing to watch, others hurrying past to avoid trouble. "Let go of me," Sophie shouted, pulling her arm with all the strength her thin body could muster. But it was useless. Edward's grip was like a steel cuff. "Do you have any idea what you just tried to do, young lady?" Edward asked, his voice now more controlled but still authoritative. Sophie didn't answer. Tears began to form in her eyes, blurring her vision. Her entire plan, all her courage, crumbling in seconds. "I should call the police right now," Edward continued, pulling out his phone with his free hand. That was when Sophie's desperation overflowed. "Please, no, I needed the money. My grandma's dying. We have nothing to eat. Her medicine ran out." The words poured out in a torrent, broken by sobs. Edward hesitated, his finger hovering over the phone screen. He looked more closely at the girl before him. Worn clothes, messy hair, deep circles under eyes far too young for such weight. Her story could be true, or it could just be another trick of a street-smart kid. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" he asked, his voice now softer but still wary. Sensing an opening, Sophie pressed on. "I can prove it. Come with me, see how we live. Please, sir, I've never done this before. I didn't know what else to do." A small crowd had already gathered around them. Edward looked around, conscious of the curious, judging gazes. He didn't want a scene, much less be seen as the wealthy man who had a hungry child arrested. With a deep sigh, Edward made a decision that would change the course of many lives. "Fine, show me where you live. But if this is a trick—" "It's not, I swear," Sophie interrupted, a glimmer of hope shining in her eyes. Edward released Sophie's wrist but kept a firm hand on her shoulder. "Lead the way to your home, and don't even think of trying to run." Together they walked through the streets, leaving the upscale commercial area and heading into poorer neighborhoods. The contrast between Edward, in his spotless suit, and Sophie, in her worn clothes, couldn't have been starker. As they advanced, Edward felt a growing unease. Part of him still suspected an elaborate trick, but another part was beginning to believe the desperate story of the girl. Sophie, for her part, struggled with waves of fear and hope. What if he didn't believe her? What if he called the police anyway? Or worse, what if he actually helped, but it was too late for her grandma? When they finally reached the narrow street where Sophie lived, Edward stopped, looking incredulously at the run-down homes around him. "This is it," Sophie said softly, pointing to a battered door. Edward hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, show me the truth." As Sophie opened the creaking door, neither of them could have imagined how their lives were about to intertwine in ways that would change everything. Fate, in its mysterious web, had brought together two souls from completely different worlds, and the consequences of this union were only beginning to unfold. The creak of the door echoed in the oppressive silence of the small house. Sophie entered first, her body tense like a violin string about to snap. Edward followed, having to duck slightly to pass through the low doorway. The smell of dampness and medicine filled Edward's nose immediately. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The weak sunlight seeping through dirty windows revealed an even more desolate interior than he had imagined. "Gran?" Sophie called softly, her voice trembling. "There's someone here who wants to help us." A faint murmur came from a corner of the room. Edward followed the sound with his eyes and saw a frail figure huddled on a makeshift bed. His heart tightened as he took in the elderly woman's weakened state. "Sophie, who?" Grandma Mary's voice was barely a hoarse whisper. Edward took a step forward, suddenly feeling out of place in his expensive suit. "Ma'am, I'm Edward Green, your granddaughter." "Well, She tried to steal from me today." Grandma Mary attempted to sit up, alarmed, but a violent cough stopped her. Sophie rushed to her grandmother's side, holding her hand and giving Edward a pleading look. "Please don't call the police," Sophie begged. "I just wanted to help my grandma. Look at her, please." Edward stepped closer to the bed, observing more carefully. Grandma Mary was clearly very ill. Her skin had a greyish tint and her breathing was labored. Beside the bed, an improvised table displayed a few bottles of medicine, most of them empty. "How long has she been like this?" Edward asked, his tone now softer. "Months," Sophie replied, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "She gets worse every day. I didn't know what else to do." Edward looked around the single-room apartment. He noticed the lack of food, the peeling walls, the ceiling marred with stains from leaks. The poverty was palpable, suffocating. "Where are your parents?" he asked, although he suspected the answer. "They died 3 years ago," Sophie replied, her voice barely audible. "An accident. Since then it's just been me and Grandma." Edward felt a wave of conflicting emotions, compassion for the desperate situation of the girl and her grandmother, guilt for his privileged life, and a strange sense of familiarity he couldn't explain. Grandma Mary coughed again, and Edward noticed an empty medicine bottle in her trembling hand. "This medication," he said, picking up the bottle. "It's expensive, isn't it?" Sophie nodded. "Very, and without it, Grandma." She couldn't finish the sentence. Edward fell silent for a moment, thoughtful. His rational mind told him to call the authorities, to handle the situation officially. But something in his heart stopped him. "Sophie," he finally said, "what you did today was wrong, very wrong. Do you understand that?" The girl lowered her head, ashamed. "Yes, sir, I know, but you were desperate," Edward finished. He sighed deeply, making a decision that would change the course of many lives. "I'll help you." Sophie's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and disbelief in her gaze. "Really, you mean it?" Edward nodded. "I'll make sure your grandmother gets the proper medical care, and we'll solve the issue of food and medicine." Tears of relief welled up in Sophie's eyes. She stood up as if to hug Edward, but hesitated, unsure. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know how to thank you." Edward smiled slightly. "You can thank me by promising never to try to steal from anyone again. Agreed?" Sophie nodded vigorously. "I promise, I swear." As Edward pulled out his phone to make a few calls, he couldn't shake the strange sense of familiarity in Grandma Mary's face. A feeling washed over him, as if he were on the verge of an important revelation. Grandma Mary, who had been silently watching the interaction between Edward and her granddaughter, finally spoke, her voice weak but clear. "Mr. Edward, your kindness reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago." Edward frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean, Mom?" But before Grandma Mary could answer, she was overcome by another coughing fit. Sophie quickly went to her aid while Edward called for an ambulance. As they waited for help to arrive, Edward couldn't stop thinking about Grandma Mary's comment. Who could she possibly be remembering? And why did he feel like he was about to uncover something that would change everything? The distant sound of ambulance sirens broke his thoughts. Edward looked at Sophie, who held her grandmother's hand tightly, and at Grandma Mary, whose closed eyes concealed secrets he couldn't yet imagine. At that moment, Edward knew his life had changed irrevocably. What had started as a normal day had transformed into something much greater, and as the ambulance approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of a journey that would reveal long-buried truths and test the limits of his compassion and understanding. The ambulance siren echoed through the narrow streets as Edward, Sophie, and Grandma Mary arrived at the hospital. The frantic activity of the emergency room contrasted sharply with the oppressive quiet of the small apartment they had left behind. As the paramedics transferred Grandma Mary onto a stretcher, Edward noticed the look of panic on Sophie's face. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he said, hoping to sound more confident than he felt. Then a nurse approached, quickly asking questions about Grandma Mary's medical history. Sophie, with a trembling voice, tried to answer as best she could, though much of her grandmother's condition was a mystery to her. "Sir," the nurse addressed Edward, "are you a relative?" Edward hesitated for a moment. No, I'm a family friend, he replied, surprising himself with his own words. I see. Well, we'll need someone to fill out forms and make decisions if necessary. Edward nodded. I'll take care of it. While Grandma Mary was taken in for tests, Edward guided Sophie to the waiting room. The contrast between them couldn't have been more evident him in his expensive suit, her in her worn-out clothes. Yet there was an undeniable connection, forged in the extraordinary circumstances of the last few hours. Are you hungry? Edward asked, realizing that hours had passed since the incident on the street. Sophie shook her head, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud rumble. Edward couldn't help but smile. I'll go get her something to eat. Don't go anywhere, okay? When Edward returned with sandwiches and water, he found Sophie examining an old photograph she'd taken from her pocket. He sat beside her, offering the food. Are those your parents? He asked gently, indicating the photo. Sophie nodded, tears forming in her eyes. And Grandma when she was younger, she explained, pointing to a smiling woman beside the couple. Edward leaned in to get a better look, and in that moment it felt as though the ground had disappeared from under his feet. His heart began to race, and he had to grip the chair to keep from falling. This isn't possible, he murmured, more to himself than to Sophie. What is it? Sophie asked, alarmed by Edward's sudden change in demeanor. With trembling hands, Edward took the photo. The younger woman in the image, Sophie's grandmother, was unmistakable. Mary? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Sophie looked at him, confused. Yes, that's my grandma. How do you know her name? Edward could barely breathe. Memories he had long buried flooded his mind, a sunny kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cookies, a gentle voice humming as she tidied the house. I know her, Edward finally managed to say. Or rather, I knew her, Mary. She worked at my house when I was a child. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. What, but how? Edward stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth, trying to gather his thoughts. She was more than a housekeeper. Mary. She practically raised me. She was always there, caring for me, comforting me when my parents were too busy. Sophie listened, her mouth open, unable to fully process what she was hearing. But then she was gone, Edward continued, his voice now filled with emotion. One day she just wasn't there anymore. No one explained what happened. I was young, maybe around 18. I was devastated. Sophie finally found her voice. Grandma never mentioned working for a wealthy family. She only said she had to leave an important job for complicated reasons. Edward stopped pacing, turning to face Sophie. Complicated reasons? He frowned, sensing there was more to this story than he knew. Just then, a doctor entered the waiting room. Family of Mary Green. Edward and Sophie stood up simultaneously. The doctor looked at them curiously, but continued. She's stable now. We managed to control the episode, but her condition is still delicate. You can see her briefly. Following the doctor down the hospital hallways, Edward felt like he was walking in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. How was it possible that Mary, the woman who had been so crucial to his childhood, was now in this situation? And why had she left so suddenly? Entering the room, Edward saw Mary lying in bed, looking small and frail among the medical equipment. Her eyes were closed, but at the sound of their footsteps, she opened them slowly. Her gaze passed over Sophie, a faint smile forming on her lips. But when her eyes landed on Edward, a mixture of emotions crossed her face: surprise, recognition, and fear. Edward? Her voice was just a whisper. My God, is it really you? Edward stepped closer to the bed, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Yes, Mary, it's me. Tears began streaming down Mary's wrinkled cheeks. After all these years. Oh, Edward, forgive me, I never meant to leave like that. Sophie looked from her grandmother to Edward, sensing that she was about to witness the revelation of a long-held secret. Edward, for his part, knew he was on the verge of discovering the truth that had haunted him for years. The air in the room was thick with tension and unspoken emotions. It was clear that the past and the present were about to collide in a way none of them could have predicted. The hospital room fell silent after Mary's revelations. Edward stood by the window, his mind a whirlwind of emotions and conflicting thoughts. Sophie, seated by her grandmother's bedside, shifted her gaze between the two adults, trying to process everything she had heard. Finally, Edward turned, his face resolute. "Mary," he began, his voice firm, "I'm going to take care of everything. Your treatment, your medication, whatever it takes to get you well." Mary's tired eyes filled with tears. "Edward, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "It's the least I can do after all these years. Please let me help." Sophie watched the scene with a mix of hope and skepticism. Part of her wanted to believe Edward's words, to believe in the help that could save her grandmother. But another part, hardened by years of struggle and disappointment, found it hard to trust so easily. "And what do you want in return?" Sophie asked abruptly, her voice laced with suspicion. Edward turned to her, surprised. "In return? I don't want anything, Sophie. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." Sophie stood up, facing Edward. Though she was much smaller than him, her stance was defiant. "Nobody does anything for free in this world. What's your angle? Are you going to make Grandma work for you again when she gets better?" "Sophie!" Mary exclaimed, shocked at her granddaughter's boldness. Edward, however, didn't seem offended. He knelt down to Sophie's eye level, his expression serious but gentle. "I understand your distrust, Sophie. You've had to be strong and take care of your grandmother for a long time. But I promise, I have no hidden motives. I want to help because Mary was important to me and because you both deserve a better life." Sophie held his gaze, searching for any sign of deception in Edward's eyes. "How can we be sure? What if you change your mind? What if—" "Sophie, my love," Mary interjected softly. "Sometimes we have to have faith in people. Edward was always a good boy, and now he's a good man. If he says he'll help us, we should believe him." Edward gave Mary a grateful smile before turning back to Sophie. "Look, I know words don't mean much to you right now, so how about this? I'll prove it with actions, starting right now." He stood up and took out his phone. "I'm going to call the best specialist I know. We'll make sure your grandmother gets the best care possible. And as for you, Sophie, how about we go get some new clothes and decent food afterward?" Sophie hesitated, still distrustful, but the mention of food made her stomach growl audibly. Edward couldn't help but smile. "See, your body agrees with me," he teased gently. A small reluctant smile appeared on Sophie's face. "Fine," she relented, "but I'll be keeping an eye on you." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Edward replied, a glint of admiration in his eyes for the girl's strength and loyalty. While Edward made calls, arranging consultations and exams for Mary, Sophie approached her grandmother's bed. "Gran," she whispered, "do you really trust him?" Mary took Sophie's hand, squeezing it lightly. "Yes, dear. Edward has always had a good heart, and now, as an adult, he has the means to make a difference. Give him a chance." Sophie nodded slowly, still not entirely convinced but willing to try. She watched Edward talking on the phone, his voice firm and decisive as he arranged Mary's treatment. There was an efficiency in his actions that Sophie had never experienced before, the power to make things happen with a simple call. When Edward finished, he turned to them with a confident smile. "All set. Dr. Jones, one of the best cardiologists in the country, will be here in an hour to evaluate your grandmother, and I've reserved a private room to ensure she gets the best possible care." Sophie felt a wave of relief mixed with a pang of guilt for her earlier distrust. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Edward stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Hey, it's okay. I understand it's hard to trust, but I promise, we're in this together now. We'll take care of your grandmother and make sure you both have a better life from here on." In that moment, watching the interaction between her granddaughter and Edward, Mary felt a wave of hope she hadn't felt in years. Maybe, she thought, after so long, things were finally beginning to look up. And perhaps, just maybe, this was the chance to right past wrongs and build a better future for all of them. Dr. Jones, a middle-aged man with kind eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, finished his thorough examination of Mary. Edward and Sophie waited anxiously in the corner of the room, both tense with anticipation. "Well," the doctor began, turning to them, "Mary's condition is serious but not hopeless. With proper treatment and intensive care, I believe we can see significant improvement." Edward exhaled in relief, while Sophie squeezed her grandmother's hand, tears of hope shining in her eyes. "What's the next step, Doctor?" Edward asked, his voice firm and determined. "We'll start with a series of medications to stabilize her heart condition. Then we'll consider a minimally invasive procedure to improve blood flow." As Dr. Jones explained the treatment details, Sophie watched Edward closely. She still had her reservations, but she couldn't deny the genuine concern and care in his eyes as he asked questions and took notes. After the doctor left, promising to return later, a comfortable silence settled over the room. Mary had fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's events. "Do you really understand all of this?" Sophie asked Edward, breaking the silence. Edward smiled lightly. "Not all of it, to be honest, but I'm learning. I want to make sure we're doing the best for her." Sophie nodded, feeling a hint of gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." Edward sat down beside her. "Sophie, I know it's still hard for you to trust me, but I want you to know that I'm committed to helping you and your grandmother. Not just because of the past, but because it's the right thing to do." Sophie studied him for a moment before asking, "What was she like when she worked for your family?" Edward's face lit up with a nostalgic smile. "Mary was amazing. She always had a smile on her face no matter how tough the day was. She made the best chocolate chip cookies you can imagine." Sophie smiled, recognizing her grandmother in his description. "She still does, or did, before she got too sick to cook. She used to comfort me when I had nightmares," Edward continued, his voice softened by the memory. "My parents were always so busy, but Mary, she always had time for me." As Edward shared more memories, Sophie felt her defenses begin to lower. It was clear that this man truly cared about her grandmother. "There's something I don't understand," Sophie said after a while. "If you two were so close, why didn't you look for her after she left?" Edward fell silent for a moment, guilt evident on his face. "I should have," he admitted, "but at the time I was young and confused. My father told me she'd stolen from us, and I believed him. It was easier to be angry than to deal with the pain of losing her." Sophie frowned. "But now you know the truth. What are you going to do about your brother?" Edward sighed heavily. "Honestly, I don't know. It's a complicated situation. Richard is my brother, but what he did, I can't ignore it." Just then, Mary stirred in bed, her eyes opening slowly. "Edward, Sophie," she called weakly. They both rushed to her bedside. "We're here, Gran," Sophie replied, holding her grandmother's hand. "Are you too?" Mary began, her voice trembling. "Need to know the whole truth." Edward and Sophie exchanged worried looks. "What truth, Mary?" Edward asked gently. Mary took a deep breath, gathering her strength. "That night when I saw Richard taking the money and jewelry, it wasn't the first time I saw him doing something like that." Edward felt his heart tighten. "What do you mean?" "Weeks before, I had seen him looking through some documents in your father's office, important company papers. At the time, I didn't understand what was happening, but now..." Sophie, sensing the gravity of what her grandmother was revealing, squeezed her hand encouragingly. "I think Richard was involved in something bigger, Edward. Something beyond just gambling debts." Edward felt as though the ground was shifting under his feet. The implications of what Mary was saying were enormous. If Richard was involved in illicit activities within the family company, "Why didn't you say anything before?" Edward asked, his voice barely disguising his shock. "I was afraid," Mary admitted, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Afraid of what might happen to you, to your family. And then when I was accused, it felt too late." Silence fell over the room as everyone processed this new revelation. Sophie looked from her grandmother to Edward, seeing the internal struggle on the man's face. "What are you going to do now?" Sophie asked Edward quietly. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, there was a steely determination in his gaze. "I'm going to find out the truth. All of it. No matter what it costs." As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, casting long shadows across the room, Edward, Sophie, and Mary found themselves united by a common purpose. The past, with all its secrets and lies, was finally coming to light, and with it, the promise of a future that none of them could have imagined just a few hours before. The constant beeping of machines echoed down the hospital hallway, mixing with the sound of hurried footsteps and tense voices. Sophie, sitting on a hard chair in the waiting room, kept her eyes fixed on the double doors leading to the intensive care unit. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them tightly in her lap, trying to contain the panic threatening to consume her. Hours earlier, Mary's condition had suddenly worsened. What had started as a simple cough quickly turned into a severe respiratory crisis. Sophie could still hear the terrifying sound of the heart monitor alarm, signaling that her grandmother's heart was failing. Edward, who had been away handling some issues related to Mary's treatment, received the news over the phone and rushed back to the hospital. Now he paced back and forth in the waiting room, his usually impeccable suit looking disheveled and his face filled with worry. "Any news?" he asked for the 10th time in half an hour, briefly stopping in front of Sophie. She just shook her head, unable to find her voice. Edward nodded, understanding, and resumed his anxious pacing. Suddenly, the ICU doors opened, and Dr. Jones emerged, his face a mask of professional seriousness. Edward and Sophie immediately stood up, approaching the doctor with a mix of hope and fear. "How is she, doctor?" Edward asked, his voice tense. Dr. Jones sighed heavily. "The situation is critical. Mary's heart is very weak and her lungs are compromised. We need a specific piece of equipment to perform an emergency procedure, but..." "But what?" Sophie interrupted, her voice shaking. "The necessary equipment isn't available in this hospital right now," the doctor explained, frustration evident in his voice. "The nearest one is at a private hospital 150 miles away." Sophie felt her world collapsing. 150 miles. Her grandmother didn't have that much time. That was when Edward stepped forward, his posture changing visibly. Gone was the worried man pacing the waiting room. In his place stood a determined, resourceful individual ready to move mountains. "What's the exact name of the equipment?" he asked, his tone firm and decisive. Dr. Jones, a bit surprised by the sudden shift, provided the details. Without hesitation, Edward pulled out his phone and began making a series of quick, intense calls. Sophie watched stunned as Edward spoke with authority, demanding immediate action from people whose names she had never heard before. In a matter of minutes, he hung up and turned to the doctor. "The equipment will be here in an hour," he announced. "I'm sending a private helicopter to pick it up." Dr. Jones blinked, clearly impressed. "A helicopter? That's extraordinary, Mr. Green, but the cost..." "The cost doesn't matter," Edward interrupted. "What matters is saving Mary's life. Prepare everything necessary for the procedure. The equipment will be here in time." As the doctor hurried back to the ICU, Sophie looked at Edward with a mix of admiration and gratitude. You really did that?" Edward knelt beside her, his eyes level with hers. "Sophie, I promised I'd do everything in my power to help your grandmother, and I meant everything." The tears Sophie had been holding back for so long finally overflowed. Without thinking, she threw herself into Edward's arms, sobbing against his chest. He held her tightly, offering the comfort and security she hadn't felt in years. "It's going to be okay," he murmured, gently stroking her hair. "Your grandmother is strong. She'll get through this." The following minutes passed in a blur of activity. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, preparing for the imminent procedure. Edward remained by Sophie's side the entire time, his presence steady and reassuring. Exactly an hour later, as promised, the sound of helicopter blades filled the air. The equipment had arrived. Dr. Jones reappeared, his eyes bright with newfound hope. "Everything's ready. We're starting the procedure immediately." As the medical team wheeled the equipment into the ICU, Edward turned to Sophie. "Do you see, there's always hope. No matter how difficult it seems, there's always a way." Sophie nodded, wiping her tears. For the first time since meeting Edward, she felt complete trust in him. This man, who had been a stranger just days ago, had moved heaven and earth to save her grandmother. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up, for making the impossible happen." Edward smiled gently. "Nothing is impossible when it comes to family, Sophie, and that's what we are now, a family." As they waited for news about the procedure, Sophie reflected on how her life had changed so drastically in such a short time. The man she had tried to rob just days ago was now by her side, offering not only financial resources, but also emotional support and the promise of a better future. This crisis had revealed Edward's true character, and Sophie knew that regardless of the outcome, nothing would ever be the same again. A new chapter had begun, and with it, the hope of better days shone on the horizon. The emergency procedure was a success. Mary was stable, though still weak, resting in her hospital room. Edward and Sophie took turns keeping vigil by her bedside, exhausted but deeply relieved. It was on the third day after the crisis that Mary finally opened her eyes, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Her gaze wandered around the room, first settling on Sophie, who was curled up asleep in a nearby armchair, and then on Edward, who stood by the window, lost in thought. "Edward!" Her voice was faint but audible. Edward turned quickly, a relieved smile lighting up his tired face. He approached the bed, gently taking Mary's hand. "Mary, it's so good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by a truck," she replied with a faint smile. "But alive thanks to you." Edward shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. No, Edward," Mary interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I need to, not just for this, but for everything. And there's something you need to know, something I should have told you a long time ago." Edward frowned, noticing the sudden seriousness in Mary's tone. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaning in to hear better. "What are you talking about, Mary?" She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "About the night I was accused of theft, the truth about what really happened." Edward's heart raced. After all these years, he was finally going to hear the truth. "I didn't steal anything, Edward," Mary began, her voice trembling with emotion. "That night I was doing my usual rounds around the house before going to bed. That's when I heard voices coming from your father's office." Edward listened intently, his hands unconsciously gripping Mary's. "It was your brother, Richard. He was arguing with your father. He sounded desperate. He was talking about debts, about dangerous people threatening him." A pang of pain shot through Edward's chest at hearing his brother's name. Richard, always the golden child in their parents' eyes, involved in something so serious. "How your father refused to help," Mary continued. "He said it was time for Richard to face the consequences of his actions. That's when things got ugly." "What do you mean?" Edward asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There was a fight. I heard a loud noise, and when I looked through the crack in the door, I saw your father lying on the floor. Richard was standing there, looking horrified at what he had done." Edward felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. His brother had attacked their father? "Richard panicked," Mary went on. "He opened the safe, he knew the combination, and took some money and a few pieces of jewelry. When he left the office in a hurry, he saw me. The look in his eyes, it was pure terror." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Edward asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Mary closed her eyes, a single tear rolling down her wrinkled cheek. "Richard begged me not to tell. He said those people would kill him if he didn't pay. He promised he'd return everything soon, that he'd clear my name. And I believed him. So when my father accused you—" "I took the blame," Mary finished. "I thought I was protecting your family, Edward. I thought Richard would eventually do the right thing." Silence fell over the room as Edward processed everything he had just heard. Years of resentment and confusion were finally making sense, but the truth was more painful than he could have imagined. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked. Mary opened her eyes, looking at Edward with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Because you deserve to know the truth, because I've carried this secret for too long, and because I'm afraid Richard might still be involved in something dangerous." Just then, a movement in the armchair caught their attention. Sophie had woken up and was looking at them with wide eyes, clearly having overheard part of the conversation. "Grandma," she called, her voice small and frightened. Mary reached out to her granddaughter, who quickly ran to her side. "Oh, my love, I'm so sorry you had to hear this." Edward stood up, his mind a whirl of emotions and conflicting thoughts. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city below without really seeing it. "What are you going to do?" Sophie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to look at the two women who, in such a short time, had become so important to him. Mary, who had sacrificed everything to protect his family, even when it meant losing everything herself. And Sophie, so young and yet so strong, facing challenges no child should ever have to face. "I'm going to find out the truth," Edward replied, his voice filled with a new resolve. "I'm going to confront Richard and my father. It's time to bring everything to light." Mary nodded slowly. "Be careful, Edward. I fear this might be more dangerous than we realize." Edward approached the bed again, taking Mary's hand and placing the other on Sophie's shoulder. "Don't worry, I'll handle this and I'll keep you both safe, I promise." As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, casting a golden glow over the room, Edward knew he was standing on the brink of a journey that would change everything. The truth, long buried, was finally coming to light, and with it, the promise of justice, redemption, and perhaps a chance to heal old wounds and build a new future for all of them. Edward adjusted his tie, staring at his reflection in the elevator's mirror. The headquarters of his family's company, a towering skyscraper in the city center, had always made him feel small. Today, however, he was determined to face the giants of his past. As the doors opened on the top floor, Edward was greeted by the familiar panoramic view of the city through the glass walls. His secretary, Marcia, quickly stood up. "Mr. Green, your father and brother are waiting for you in the conference room." Edward nodded, taking a deep breath before heading down the hall. Entering the room, he was met with the curious gazes of his father, Anthony Green, and his brother, Richard. "Edward," his father began, "what a surprise. You rarely come by without giving us notice." "Father, Richard," Edward greeted, keeping his voice steady, "we have some important matters to discuss." Richard grinned, leaning back in his chair. "What's the mystery, little brother? What's this about?" Edward closed the door behind him, facing the two men. "This is about Mary." Richard's smile faltered for an instant, almost imperceptibly. Anthony frowned. "Mary? The housekeeper who supposedly stole from us years ago? What about her?" "She didn't steal anything," Edward declared, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "And you both know it." A tense silence filled the room. Anthony leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "What are you talking about, Edward?" Edward pulled out a chair and sat down, staring directly at his father and brother. "I recently reconnected with Mary. She told me everything about that night." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Edward, that was years ago. Why dig up the past now?" "Because it's time for the truth, Richard," Edward replied, his gaze fixed on his brother. "Mary told me about the argument you had with father, about the money you took from the safe." Richard's face turned visibly pale. Anthony looked between his sons, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "What nonsense is this?" Anthony exclaimed. "Richard would never do such a thing." Edward turned to his father. "Are you sure, father? Or did you just choose to believe it because it was easier than facing the truth about your favorite son?" Richard stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Are you going to believe the words of an old housekeeper after all these years?" "Sit down, Richard," Edward ordered, his voice laden with authority. To his surprise, Richard obeyed. "It's not just her words. I did my own investigation." Edward pulled a folder from his briefcase, spreading documents across the table. "Bank records, suspicious transfers, undeclared debts. Everything points to you, Richard." Anthony picked up the papers with trembling hands, his face paling with each document he examined. Richard remained silent, his gaze fixed on a distant point. "Why?" Anthony finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do this, Richard?" Richard closed his eyes, defeated. I was in trouble. Gambling debts, bad investments. I thought I could fix everything before anyone found out." "And you let an innocent woman take the blame," Edward added, disappointment evident in his voice. "I was scared," Richard burst out, "afraid of losing everything, of disappointing you, Mary. She promised not to tell. I thought I could make it right." Anthony looked as though he had aged a decade in minutes. "All these years I accused an innocent woman. I destroyed her life." Edward leaned forward. "It's not too late to make things right, Father. Mary is ill and needs care. The least we can do is help her now." Anthony nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. We'll do everything necessary to help her." Richard looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm so sorry I've carried this burden for so long. Edward studied his brother for a long moment. Regret is a start, Richard, but now we need actions. You're going to tell the whole truth and publicly clear Mary's name. Richard nodded, defeated. Yes, I'll do whatever it takes. Anthony stood, his usually imposing posture now bowed by guilt. Edward, you did what I should have done years ago. You sought the truth, no matter how painful. I'm proud of you. Edward was taken aback. For years he had sought his father's approval, and now it came at the most unexpected moment. Thank you, Father, but it's not me you owe an apology to. It's Mary and her granddaughter, Sophie. Edward gathered the documents. Tomorrow we're all going to the hospital. You'll both apologize to Mary in person, and we'll discuss how to compensate her for all these years of injustice. As he left the room, leaving his father and brother to reflect on their actions, Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth, painful as it was, had finally come to light, and with it, the hope for redemption and a new beginning for everyone involved. The hospital room was thick with the weight of unspoken emotions. Mary, sitting up in bed, looked at the new arrivals with a mix of surprise and apprehension. Sophie, standing protectively by her grandmother's side, cast wary glances at the Green family members. Edward entered first, followed by his father Anthony and his brother Richard. The contrast between the three men was striking. Edward, calm and compassionate, Anthony, visibly uncomfortable, and Richard, a shadow of the confident man he once was. Mary, Edward began softly, I brought some people who have something important to say to you. Richard stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the floor. The silence in the room was almost deafening, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitors. Mary, Richard finally spoke, his voice shaky, I am here to ask for your forgiveness. Mary tilted her head, her eyes filled with the wisdom of someone who had suffered greatly. Forgiveness for what, Richard? Richard swallowed, finally finding the courage to look into the eyes of the woman he had wronged so many years ago. For everything. For the theft, the lie, for letting you carry the blame for something I did. Sophie gasped, her eyes widening at the confession. Mary, however, remained calm, merely nodding for Richard to continue. That night, he continued, his voice growing steadier, I was desperate. I had debts, people threatening me. I thought I could handle it on my own, that no one needed to know. But when you saw me... Richard paused, tears forming in his eyes. I panicked. I begged you not to tell anyone, promised I'd return everything. And then, when my father accused you of the theft, I stayed silent. I let an innocent woman take the fall for my crime. The room was silent once more. Anthony, who had remained quiet until then, stepped forward. Mary, he said, his voice heavy with regret, there are no excuses for what we did. As a father and an employer, I failed. I failed to see the truth, failed to protect someone who was practically family. I ask for your forgiveness, knowing I may not deserve it. Mary looked at the two men standing before her, years of hurt and pain reflected in her tired eyes. Then, to everyone's surprise, a small smile appeared on her lips. You know, Mary began, her voice soft, for years I carried the weight of this injustice. There were moments when I thought the resentment would consume me. But then I looked at Sophie, and I remembered that love is stronger than hate. She extended her hand, taking Sophie's. Forgiveness isn't something easily given, but it's a gift we give to ourselves as much as to others. Richard, Anthony, I forgive you. Richard openly sobbed, falling to his knees beside her bed. Thank you, he murmured through tears. Thank you. Anthony, with silent tears running down his face, nodded in gratitude. Edward, watching the scene, felt a mix of relief and admiration. Mary, your strength and compassion are truly inspiring, but forgiveness doesn't erase the consequences of our actions. Father, Richard, you know what needs to be done. Anthony straightened, recovering some of his usual dignified posture. Yes, of course. Mary, I want to make amends for all these years of injustice. I will cover all your medical expenses, ensure that you and Sophie have a comfortable home, and establish a fund to guarantee Sophie's education. Sophie, who had been watching everything in silence, finally spoke up. "And what about my grandmother's reputation? For all these years, people thought she was a thief." Richard stood up, wiping away his tears. "I'll make a public statement. I'll tell the whole truth and clear Mary's name. It's the least I can do." Edward nodded, satisfied. "And what about you, Richard? Are you prepared to face the legal consequences of your actions?" Richard hesitated for a moment, then straightened his shoulders. "Yes, I'll turn myself in. It's time I pay for my mistakes." Mary reached for Richard's hand. "True redemption comes not just from regret, but from the actions we take to right our wrongs. I'm proud of you for taking this step." While the Green family discussed the practical steps they would take moving forward, Sophie approached Edward. "Thank you," she whispered, "for bringing the truth to light, for fighting for my grandmother." Edward smiled gently. "There's no need to thank me, Sophie. Doing the right thing is its own reward." Watching the scene before him, his father and brother seeking redemption, Mary offering forgiveness, and Sophie finally seeing justice for her grandmother, Edward felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging. There would be legal consequences to face, reputations to rebuild, and trust to regain. But in that hospital room, a new foundation was being laid. A foundation built on truth, forgiveness, and the hope for a better future for them all. The weeks that followed Richard's confession were a whirlwind of emotions and changes for everyone involved. Mary, still recovering in the hospital, watched with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation as transformations unfolded around her. Edward kept his promise, ensuring Mary received the best medical care available. Sophie, meanwhile, alternated between the joy of seeing her grandmother improve and the hesitation of fully trusting the Green family's intentions. One sunny afternoon, Edward arrived at the hospital carrying a folder of documents. Sophie, who was reading a book to her grandmother, watched him with curiosity. "Good afternoon, Mary, Sophie," Edward greeted them, his warm smile contrasting with the formality of his suit. "Edward," Mary replied with a weak smile, "it's good to see you." Sophie merely nodded, her eyes fixed on the folder in his hands. Sensing the tension, Edward decided to go straight to the point. "I brought some documents I'd like to discuss with you. They're about your future." He opened the folder, revealing a series of papers. "First, Mary, here is the deed to a home in Oakwood. It's yours now, fully furnished and adapted to meet your needs." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Edward, this is too much." Sophie, however, frowned. "Why are you doing all this, to ease your guilt?" Edward wasn't offended by the question. In fact, he appreciated Sophie's honesty. "Partly, yes," he admitted, "but it's more than that. It's about doing what's right, about fixing past mistakes." He turned to Sophie, handing her another document. "This is for you, Sophie. It's an educational fund. It will allow you to study whatever you want, wherever you want, without worrying about costs." Sophie took the paper with trembling hands, her eyes widening at the amounts involved. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now," Edward replied gently. "I know this is a lot to process, and I know that papers and money can't erase years of suffering and injustice, but I hope it can be a beginning, a foundation to rebuild trust." Mary reached out, taking Edward's hand. "Your generosity touches us deeply, Edward. But Sophie is right to be cautious. Trust is something that's built over time and actions, not just grand gestures." Edward nodded, sitting down in the chair beside the bed. "You're absolutely right. That's why I'm here today, not just to hand over these documents, but to propose something more." He looked directly at Sophie. "I'd like to invite you both to spend some time with me and my family, not at the mansion, but at a beach house we own. A neutral place where we can get to know each other better, where we can start to rebuild the bonds that were broken so long ago." Sophie exchanged a glance with her grandmother, uncertain. Mary smiled encouragingly. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said. "What do you think, dear?" Sophie hesitated for a moment. I think we can give it a try," she finally replied. "But I'm not promising anything." Edward smiled, understanding. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance." Over the following weeks, as Mary regained her strength and prepared to be discharged, the arrangements for the trip were made. Sophie, still cautious, watched Edward closely, looking for signs of insincerity or hidden motives. To her surprise, all she found was sincerity and a genuine desire to make things right. Finally, the day of the trip arrived. The beach house was a beautiful retreat, overlooking the ocean and far from the city's hustle and bustle. Edward made sure that Mary and Sophie had their own rooms, respecting their space and privacy. The first few days were marked by a tense cordiality, with everyone walking on eggshells, afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. But slowly, the barriers began to come down. It was during a particularly beautiful sunset that Sophie finally lowered her guard. She found Edward on the porch watching the horizon. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked abruptly. "Really?" Edward turned to her, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Because Mary was more than a housekeeper to me, Sophie. She was the mother I never had, and when she disappeared, well, it was like losing a part of myself." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And you, Sophie, you remind me so much of myself when I was younger, determined, skeptical, carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I want to help, not just to make up for the past, but because I genuinely care about you both." Sophie felt the tears she had held back for so long finally spill over. "I want to trust you," she admitted, "but I'm so afraid of being disappointed again." Edward knelt in front of her, meeting her gaze. "I understand that fear, Sophie, and I promise I'll do everything I can to never betray that trust. Can we build it together, day by day?" Sophie looked into Edward's eyes, searching and finding only sincerity. Slowly she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll try." In that moment, with the sun setting on the horizon and the waves gently crashing against the shore, something shifted between them. It wasn't complete trust, not yet, but it was a beginning, a seed planted that, with care and patience, could grow into something beautiful and lasting. Mary, watching the scene from her bedroom window, smiled to herself. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of possibilities, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to feel true hope. Edward sat in his office at Green Industries, surrounded by piles of documents, each representing a crucial decision he needed to make. The weight of responsibility and the desire to do what was right pressed heavily on his shoulders. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Sophie entered, still a bit hesitant, but with a newfound confidence shining in her eyes. "You wanted to see me?" Edward smiled, gesturing for her to take a seat across from him. "Yes, thank you for coming, Sophie. Please sit down." As Sophie settled in, Edward gathered his thoughts. The past weeks had been transformative for all of them. Mary was recovering well in her new home, and Sophie was beginning to accept the idea of a different future than she had ever imagined. "Sophie," Edward began, "I called you here because I have some important decisions to make and I'd like your input." Sophie's eyes widened with surprise. "My input about what?" Edward picked up one of the documents on his desk. "As you know, we're working to compensate you and your grandmother for the years of injustice you suffered. Part of that is ensuring your future." He slid a paper over to Sophie. "This is a detailed plan for your educational fund. It covers not only your college education, but also any graduate studies you want to pursue, anywhere in the world." Sophie took the document with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the impressive figures. It's too much, Edward." "It's not too much," Edward replied firmly. "It's the least we can do, but I want you to know this comes with no strings attached. You can choose any career, any path you want." Sophie looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty in her eyes. "And what if I don't know what I want to do?" Edward smiled gently. "Then you'll have the time and resources to figure it out. There's no rush, Sophie. The important thing is that you have the freedom of choice that was denied to you and your grandmother for so long." He then picked up another document. "Now about Mary. In addition to the house and her ongoing medical care, I've been considering establishing a foundation in her name." "A foundation?" Sophie asked, intrigued. Edward nodded. "Yes, an organization dedicated to helping domestic workers and their families, offering education, legal assistance, healthcare. I thought it would be a way to honor Mary's legacy and help others who might be in similar situations. Sophie was silent for a moment, processing the idea. "I think Grandma would love that," she finally said. "She always wanted to help others, even when we barely had enough for ourselves." Edward smiled, pleased with her response. "I'm glad you think so. I would love for you and Mary to be involved in planning and running this foundation, if you're interested." Sophie nodded slowly, a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. I think I'd like that." Edward then took a deep breath, moving on to the most difficult part of their conversation. "There's one more thing, Sophie. A decision I'm considering that will affect all of us." He picked up the last document on his desk, looking at it for a moment before continuing. "I'm thinking about stepping down from Green Industries." Sophie gasped, surprised. "But why? I thought the company was important to you." Edward met her gaze, his expression serious. "It is, but over the past few months I've realized there are things more important in life. The way my family has run this business, the choices they've made. I can't be part of that anymore." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm considering selling my shares in the company and using the resources to expand the foundation, to do more good. But it's a huge decision, one that will change a lot of lives." Sophie looked at him thoughtfully, sensing the inner conflict in his eyes. "Is this what you truly want to do?" Edward sighed. "I think so, but I'm afraid, Sophie, afraid of making the wrong choice, of throwing away my family's legacy." To his surprise, Sophie reached out and took his hand, offering a gesture of comfort she had never offered before. "Edward, over the past few months, you've shown us what really matters. It's not money or status, but doing what's right, helping others. If that's what your heart is telling you to do, then I think you should go ahead." Edward felt a lump form in his throat, moved by her unexpected support. "Thank you, Sophie. Your opinion means so much to me." Sophie smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "Well, you asked for my opinion, and I think Grandma would agree with me." Edward nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The decision was still daunting, but now he knew he wasn't alone. With Sophie and Mary by his side, he felt he could face any challenge. "Then it's decided," he said, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. "We'll move forward with all of these plans. Together we'll build something new, something that truly makes a difference." As Sophie left the office, Edward looked out the window at the city below. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt genuinely hopeful. The reparations they were making weren't just about compensating for the past, but about creating a better future for everyone. The sun was setting over the beach, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. On the porch of a beachside house, 3 figures watched the natural spectacle, their silhouettes outlined against the fiery horizon. Edward, now dressed more casually, had one arm gently wrapped around Mary's shoulders as she sat comfortably in a wheelchair. Sophie, standing beside them, held her grandmother's hand, her eyes shining with a mix of contentment and disbelief at the beauty of the scene. "Who would have thought," Mary murmured, her voice filled with emotion, "that after everything we'd be here together?" Edward smiled, giving her shoulder a light squeeze. "Life has surprising ways of bringing us together." Sophie nodded, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The foundation in Mary's name was flourishing, helping families in situations similar to the ones they had faced. Edward had sold his shares in Green Industries, dedicating himself fully to causes that truly mattered. "We're an odd family, aren't we?" Sophie commented, a playful smile dancing on her lips. "The best kind of family," Edward replied, pulling her into a side hug. "One built on truth, forgiveness, and love." Mary looked at the two of them, her eyes shining with joyful tears. "My heart is so full," she said. "I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again." As the last ray of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, the 3 of them remained in comfortable silence, united not by blood, but by choice. The past, with all its pain and injustices, had been transformed into a foundation for a bright future. In that perfect moment, Edward, Sophie, and Mary knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together as the family they had become.